and I didn't put in things that I couldn't document, like Charles MacArthur, the playwright Helen Hayes' husband, how, you know, things that they did together and all this in the village. But I have found some very interesting things, and one of the things we mentioned, the Pleiades Club, and he and his brother are both in their annual publication. The Pleiades Club was a club of Mark Twain belonged, of people who wanted to encourage young writers. They met in an Italian restaurant in the village, and they wanted to encourage young writers, and they did these publications and so forth. So those were years, and that's when he was 17, when he met Nathan and went in and saw Nathan, and Nathan sees this 17-year-old kid, and my father was a small man. He was very slight. And so here's this kid comes in, and he's writing these very sophisticated kind of things. So yes, he did. He saw them. They were the ones who told him to get a pen name, Murray Leinster. That's all in the book. How he got the name, where the name came from. So many people ask me where the name came from. And the people who suggested the name and so forth, and why they did it and all that, those kinds of things. But yes, that's when he was. He did not go to Virginia until he met my mother in New York. They were married in 1921, and they went immediately. He had been diddling around going to Virginia. His sister lived there, his half-sister, who was 25 years older than he. She was married, had children. He'd spent a lot of time there. There were what we call shirt-tail relatives in Virginia who owned a hotel there in Gloucester, and he did writing there and so forth, and so he decided to settle there. So it was not until 1921 that they actually bought a house and moved there. So by 1921, he was into a lot of other things. Well, see, 1919 was when Runaway Skyscraper was published. So he was moving on to a lot of other things beyond Smart Set at that time.
One of the things I've most enjoyed going to the Library of Congress and looking at his stories in Spiffy's stories and other such things was his series of sex classes.
He was what now?
He wrote a series of French, very tame, no bad language at all, but very sophisticated French-style sex classes set in Paris.
Now that's news to me. You're telling me stuff. Yeah, but be very interested. But they would be tame, because one of the editors at one time said Will Jenkins doesn't believe in sex.
The main character in the series of stories was a dissolute American expatriate by the name of Murray Leinster.
Where were they published?
Spiffy Tales.
Snappy Stories or something. Yeah, yes. Okay. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, that's what. Now, yeah.
I read one of them several years ago.
Yeah. One of the Snappy Stories. Yeah. And then there was a magazine called The Parisienne. That's another kind of funny story. I know you want to ask a question back there, but Nathan and Mencken decided there were stories that so bad they didn't want them in Smart Set, so they started what they call louse magazines. and that was Parisienne was one of the louse magazines, so you could send something in and you didn't know whether it was going to go into Smart Set or Parisienne or one of these other sleazy things, but you didn't care as long as you got a check. It was crazy, really, it was. You get a question back there?
I was wondering if there were any other artists or writers that would visit your father, and if you have any stories about what they might have talked about, or who they were, or if you can remember.
I don't know early on. I know later And there's a young man who I saw it on eBay and got it. Was interesting. The history of it. A fellow named Payne, who publishes a little pamphlet called The Last Murray Leinster Interview. And actually, he's a reporter for the Newport News Daily Press, and it was an article that he wrote for the paper. Now, my sister, the one I mentioned earlier, who wasn't part of writing the book, she and her husband have a small bi-weekly newspaper called Glowquips, and they did a lot of stories on him. And actually, I think his name is Ronald Payne. That story, I recognized it immediately because it appeared also in their paper. So people, that kind of thing down there, they did a lot of interviews, but I don't know. Early on, I don't remember that many people. There wasn't that interest, and even in the 50s and so-called golden age, science fiction didn't have the cachet that it does now, really.
Yeah. I was looking through a magazine today and I saw an editorial by Robert Silverberg. He said back in the 1950s, Will Jenkins helped him rewrite a story at the request of John Campbell Jr.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if he did that very often, if he was sort of a mentor to younger writers, or.
Well, when asked, he was very glad to do that, and a lot of people asked him. And I can remember. I remember there was an ophthalmologist in Washington D.C. who wanted to be a writer. I remember this vividly, and you'll laugh, from my childhood. I was maybe again 8 or 9 years old, and he would come and want to talk about Dad helping him with the stories, and so we would go up sometimes to Washington and visit, and this Dr. Newell was his name. He had a chauffeur and a very handsome, light-colored African-American chauffeur. And we 3 children were given to the chauffeur for the day. And he would take us to the zoo and take us to Shraff's, where I always had chicken noodle soup. But you know, those are the funny memories that but there were always people but generally not people who really wanted to write, other than, now for instance, Michael Swanwick talks about when he was at William and Mary coming and visiting. His professor brought him. But he always was glad to help, but he did complain a lot. Because he said that he would try to tell them what you had to do to make the story work, and they were artists and didn't want him to interfere with their deathless prose. And so that's the thing. Bob Silverberg's story, which again, he was very generous in telling and allowing us to use in the book. He was at okay, stop. Can I finish my sentence? Can't finish the sentence. Okay.